This next section covers just basic ideas of fertility and things to keep in mind as we keep charting. Okay, first of all, ovulation is controlled by a very delicate balance of hormones. I know it sounds kind of obvious, but one thing you may or may not know is ovulation only occurs on one day in each cycle. So you can't have ovulation occur one day and then a week later it would happen another day. If a woman has 2 ovulations or more, it would happen on the same day. So if you have non-identical twins in the family or something like that, that was because you had 2 eggs that ruptured on the same 24-hour time period. Now, the ovum will live for 12 to 24 hours. I mentioned the possible days of ovulation are going to be on peak day or up to 2 days after. So most likely, by the way, I think you have a 60% chance or so of peak happening or ovulation happening on peak day. Now, that ovum will only live for 24 hours max, so 1 day. So if ovulation happens as late as the 2nd day after peak, then that 3rd day is completely fertile as well. Sperm need mucus to survive. Without it, they die very quickly. Don't have an exact time limit, but it's going to be a few hours. And in favorable mucus, they can live for up to 5 days. So if you have intercourse on an infertile day where the mucus plug is in place, you don't have to worry because the sperm will die very quickly. And if you have intercourse on a possibly fertile day, well, maybe it's the first day of your fertile cycle, but if you have peak within the next 5 days, the sperm could live up until the day of ovulation. Now, once ovulation occurs, menstruation will begin again 11 to 16 days after peak. So I mentioned that before. 11 to 16 days after peak is when your next cycle will start. So if you identify peak, you can pretty much determine when your next bleed will begin. Fertility will require adequate hormone levels, satisfactory mucus, healthy sperm, healthy fallopian tubes, and endometrium, of course, has to be healthy as well. And then the last thing is recommended, but not needed, obviously. A loving relationship is always recommended between the couple. But remember, this is a combined effort. This is not one person controlling fertility. This is not her thing. Okay, now for conception, that's when, of course, the sperm meets the egg. At that point, we have a new human life. It will travel down getting ahead of myself. Conception will occur in the outer third of the fallopian tube, so somewhere in this area right over here. After that happens, the egg will travel, or the baby will travel down the fallopian tube and implant in the uterine wall, and that is implantation. Now, pregnancy can result from genital contact on days of fertility without penetration or ejaculation. This is a very, very important point here, okay? We've actually had a student over the last 10 years who conceived this way. Now, they knew what they were doing, they did it anyway, and they still chart to this day and they're doing just fine, okay? So keep in mind, anybody can do NFP, but sometimes you actually have to follow the rules. That's part of the deal. Now, we ask you to abstain from genital contact on days of fertility because if you guys are, if you decide, you know what, we won't have sex, but we're going to do everything but have sex. Well, you could be touching each other, and if he's touching her vulva and she's touching his penis, there could be some transfer of semen, and that could get to the vulva, and they know exactly where to go. Okay, so oftentimes people don't realize that before a man ejaculates, semen will usually collect on the tip of the penis, and usually those will contain sperm cells. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're going to engage in genital contact, don't get upset if you do get pregnant. Okay, so we ask you, if you're serious about your goals, abstain from genital contact on all days of fertility. The next section will be on how to make observations, and this is the most important section of the whole presentation. So if you're not paying attention or you're kind of paying attention, this is where you need to take notes. What you need to realize is you need to observe daily, and that's throughout the day. So your NFP business is always open. You're always keeping in mind what is happening. Again, the primary thing we're charting is sensation at the vulva. So that's what you sense during your normal daily activities. Now, secondary is appearance. We want you to chart anything you see, but that is secondary. So if you see something, chart it. Keep in mind, if I see a chart that says cloudy, clear, little, lots, that is a totally inadequate chart. I can't use that at all, okay? If you only have dry, damp, wet, that is enough information to determine your fertility, okay? I'd rather see both, but I have to have sensation on that chart. Again, no internal investigations, and I don't think many people douche nowadays. I think that was a thing of the past, but don't do that. So what you need to do is focus on your sensation at the vulva throughout the day, as you're walking around throughout your house, to work, to the car, to the coffee pot, to the bathroom, but not in the bathroom. How do you feel when you're walking around, conducting normal activities? Now, you can ignore times of the day that obviously are going to affect your charting. For instance, let's say you work out. Don't pay attention to sensation while you're working out. Okay, that's not a good example. Or if you're swimming or something like that, you can kind of just mentally take those blocks of the day out if you engage in some sort of activity like that. But ask yourself, has anything changed? Okay, or are you feeling the same sensation? So has anything changed, or is it the same? Again, think about intensity. Make mental notes throughout the day, and at the end of the day, you're going to chart your most fertile sensation. Okay, just remember, sensation is the most important observation. Now, what is sensed at the vulva? Here are some examples of what you might feel. You could feel times of dryness, which is a sensation of nothingness. If you tell me I don't know what I felt, then that's a dry sensation. Okay, you can feel sticky. Now, sticky is not the look of the mucus. I want to make that very clear. Don't put dry sticky. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, we chart the most fertile sensation, so you would just simply put sticky if you actually felt sticky. Now, feeling sticky is where your labia feel like they're stuck together. It's not like, hey, I saw mucus that looks sticky. Okay, so please keep that in mind. Moist or damp are good words to use to describe the presence of moisture, but nothing like a saturated feeling. So you could be much more wet. You just have it's kind of like a sweaty feeling or like a humid feeling, if you want to put it that way. So use the word moist or damp, whichever one identifies with you better, to describe that type of feeling. Then wet, I want you to reserve the word wet on your chart until you have a wetness, a feeling of wetness that's like saturation. So think in terms of a sponge, okay? A sponge can be totally dry. It's completely dry. It can also, you can run it underwater, but just barely enough to get it wet, and then you can squish it and it'll go back to its shape, but you can't squeeze anything out of it. That might be a moist day, okay? But you could put more and more water in that sponge to the point where it's just totally saturated. That's what a wet sensation is. Now, you could have a level in between. You only want to have about 4 to 5 sensations max. So don't have like, we had a student once who had 9 levels of sensations. Okay, that's way too much detail. So about 4 or 5 is enough. But there are some days where I mentioned my wife, she has a BIP of moist. So she always feels the presence of some sort of moisture. But when we enter fertility, we have that to a higher degree. So she calls it more moist, okay? Now, I don't want you to have more moist as well. You only need 1 level in between if that's the case. But keep in mind, moist is a presence of discharge, or I'm sorry, the feeling of moisture. Wet is a saturated feeling, like you need to change your underwear. Slippery would be this very similar to wet. You're going to feel saturated just like you would on a wet day, but as you walk around, you're probably going to feel your labia gliding together. Okay, so it's more intensely wet. It's kind of like the difference between putting that sponge in water and then putting it in oil. Both times they're wet, but when you put it in oil, it has a different feeling to it. And that's the same thing with a slippery sensation. Okay, some women don't notice slippery when walking around. If that's the case, check with us. We never accept wiping sensations as a valid sensation, so don't tell me you felt moist or wet while you wiped. The only situation at which I would kind of buy that as an answer is if you're already wet and, I'm sorry, if you charted slippery, but you felt wet walking around, but when you wiped, it just did not come off. You couldn't get clean, in other words. That would be a good example of a slippery day. So we'll talk more about that later. What's important to understand is use the same word to describe the same thing. Don't use different words to describe the same thing. So don't call moist one day and then call it damp the next day. And then I ask you, what's the difference between moist and damp? And you're like, well, they're kind of the same thing. Okay, we'll chart them as the same word. Just remember, keep it simple. This is not hard. People do this in third world countries. A lot of them don't even know how to write. So keep in mind, you don't even have to know how to do that. We've seen a primitive chart before where people put sticks and flowers in their hair to symbolize what part of the cycle they were on. So this can be done low tech or high tech. Fortunately, we do have an app for this. So if you happen to see anything, you want to describe what you saw. So that is very important. Okay, so if you do see mucus, please put that on there, or discharge, I should say. Okay, some women don't ever see anything, they only sense the presence of discharge. That's okay. All right, discharge is defined as anything that leaves the vagina, meaning cervical mucus, seminal fluid, bleeding, etc. And by the way, you won't know the difference between seminal fluid and cervical mucus. They look the same. Now, if any mucus is seen, you want to describe it as best you can. What I mentioned is be consistent on the types of things you are charting. Okay, so for instance, if you're charting a color, you might have clear, you might have cloudy, you might have white. So those are all valid colors right there. But don't chart color one day and then consistency the next day, like stringiness or tackiness, something like that. I'd expect you to put the same types of things every day. And I really recommend charting the consistency or the fluidity of the mucus over the color, because the color can vary. But what really tells you a lot is the mucus like a tacky type of mucus? Is it more viscous or less viscous? Is it a kind of creamy looking discharge? Is it stringy, where it just kind of resembles raw egg whites and gets stuck to the tissue paper and your body as you're wiping? Okay, that's really important. Is it a thick type of discharge? Is it a thin type of discharge? These are all good words to use, but again, chart the same thing day after day. Okay, you never need to touch the mucus. We're not asking you to finger test anything or be creative in that sense, okay? And use your own words. It's important to understand. Again, keep it simple. So how to chart? We're going to chart the red sticker on any day of bleeding. Now, if you have a day of spotting, we're going to use a red sticker with dots. Now, the next sticker is very important. We're going to use a green sticker on your chart whenever you feel dry and see nothing. Now, some gals feel dry but see a discharge, maybe dried on their underwear, or they see it when they wipe. That gal will record the sensation as dry. However, she will not record a green sticker on those days. In the beginning, she will use a white baby to indicate possible fertility. Now, if we notice after a while that this is an infertile pattern, we'll tell you to use the yellow sticker later on. The yellow sticker simply means infertile discharge. Okay, that will happen if you have a BIP of unchanging discharge, or it will happen after peak. Okay, so just keep in mind, don't use that one yet. In the beginning, we're only going to chart the red sticker over here. We're going to chart the green sticker for dry, nothing felt, nothing seen. And if you feel dry and see mucus, or if you happen to feel or see anything else, you're going to put a white baby. So in the first 14 days of charting, you're going to have a lot of white babies. That doesn't mean you're fertile. Now, peak will be indicated with an X, and then the 3 days after peak will be either green or yellow babies. Again, green baby will be a feeling of dryness and you don't see anything. So dry, nothing felt, nothing seen will be this one. So these are identical. This just happens to happen on the 3 days after peak. If you have the yellow babies, those will be days of moisture, and that will be on the 3 days after peak as well. That will be explained more and more in the second session. Again, you only need red, green, and white baby for the first however long until your first chart review. Now, if you have intercourse, you're going to put an I on that sticker. Okay. Now, if you're so on top of the sticker, not in place of the sticker, keep that in mind. Okay. And then the last thing is if you're colorblind, we do have symbols that we can use. That's something that you can, if you have that problem, then please let us know. Now, we record the most fertile characteristic each day. Okay, so maybe you felt dry half the day and then moist the other half of the day, you'd record moist. Okay, so sensation is first, appearance is second. Don't just chart appearance, you need the sensation. And then keep it simple. Okay, the next part of the training will go over how to chart the stickers in conjunction with the normal cycle.